How to heal post narcissistic abuse. I think this is a very complicated issue. It's incredibly hard to heal from narcissistic abuse. But to do that, what we actually need to do is separate and individuate away from the narcissist. This introject that's in your body that's causing you so much concern and so much disturbance. So, how do we go about doing that? Well, I can tell you how I went about separating myself from the shared fantasy. And it took several years to do it, to properly do it. And that is because it relates back to your own childhood dynamics, your own sort of attachment to your mother or whatever caregiver figure that was the main person in your life. And whenever we understand what separation individuation is all about, it gives us a vast look into the shared fantasy. And we can understand why Sam Vaknin took Sander's shared fantasy and imposed it on top of a narcissistic structure. So, for us to separate and individuate as a child, we needed to feel frustrated with our parents and we needed to go and venture away or, you know, if we remember back to our own children whenever they were growing up, whenever they found their legs, they wanted to go and explore, and that's all part of that, and if they've a good enough sense of mother, they'll always look back. They'll want them to be looked back to see where, and they know mum's there, and that gives them a sense of security and so on and so forth. And then over time that grows, and mother pro-socializes the child more. The child will go to groups, and eventually they will start seeing the difference between themselves and others, because as children fuse with their parents. They merge completely with their parents, um, and that sense of mother or father that they have inside of them is incredibly important for their developmental trajectory on their psychological outlook and their emotional outlook. And it's in here that we understand that narcissists, because of their inability to be separate from others, i.e., others are an extension of them, because by the very fact they live in an internal world and they are perceived, not that they perceive anybody else. And this is a clear indicator of that still fused, unable to um, individuate away from external objects, even though there is no object constancy for these um, external objects, but that's because they're interchangeable, because it is in an internal world. So, therefore, because it's part of them, to be discarded is nothing. If it is no longer of any use to them, then it is nothing. Um, but it's quite the opposite whenever it comes to their false sense of mother. They can't get rid of that because that is fused and merged. And it's in here we understand the shared fantasy a little bit more, and we look at what happens to a child. A child, for the first 3 years of their life, the right brain of the mother effectively becomes the right brain of the child. And there is the shared fantasy. There is the colonization of the brain. There are all the projections from mum, which in this case it would be the narcissist in our life. And how we operate and see the world comes via that um, sort of methodology by the narcissist. So I think for me, the key thing about learning how to separate myself from that was watching Dr. Alan Shore and digesting as much as his work as I possibly could to learn about developmental psychology. Because once you see where these things come into play and how that affects our neuromodulation in our brain and what that then does to our synaptical connections, and how that then becomes something that's strengthened, by that fire and wire process. And if we can get our heads around that and understand these permanent thoughts that we think we've got in our mind aren't, they're being given energy, and the energy that we're given to it is causing this fire and wire. And the more you fire those wires, the stronger that connection becomes. So that introject, that narcissistic introject, has been really pummeled into us over and over and over again. And that means that separating from that takes a lot of work. So once we understand the principles of our brain, and why we, enter into repetition compulsion, which is basically your right brain um, sort of searching for safety in familiarity, because that's what it does, um, regardless of whether it's safe or not. That's just the way it works. It depends on our sense of self as to whether we are going to repeat that pattern or not. And this is where object relations comes in, and understanding your own object relations, understanding your attachment type and why you are that way, and what relationship you had with your caregivers, and then looking at your own sort of life experiences in relation to those object relations, and how that had an impact on your attachment styles, or on your fawning, or on your fighting, or on your flighting, whatever it may have been. Have a look at your way of being in relation to other objects, but base that upon your relationship with your initial caregivers, because the basis of all our attachments lead on, and will always lead on until we address it, unless it's okay. Um, it'll be a repeating pattern of that with your mother, um, and it's not necessarily a healthy thing anyway. We should be individuating away and becoming that separate person away from our family, and beginning our own start in life. And this is really what needs to happen post narcissistic abuse. And this is why transactional analysis for me was so important, because it kept me in the adult ego, because we've been infantilized, we've been regressed back, and we're now operating in a very infantile ego defense manner, which is causing us to denial and withdraw, and devalue ourselves, split, see them all good and ourselves all bad. We need to turn that round. So with our rational brain, with our adult mind, we need to start going through all the transgressions, and understanding that we had a right to feel the way we felt at the time, but we didn't express. And we weren't wrong in our intuition and all the things that we thought about this person, or maybe had started to realize and hope weren't going to be true. They were true. You were right. You did see things the right way. And that's really, really important, you know? And then it's about responsibility for our own actions. It's about, it's about self discovery. It's about going backwards and starting to have a look at yourself, and look at your own repeating patterns. Your acknowledgement of your own patterns and addressing them is being an adult. It's being an adult. It's not staying in that infantile place. And we have to grow up after narcissistic abuse, because it's like the harshest lesson in having your innocence taken away. You know, I talked about this here with Sarah from Cluster B Milkshake. You know, that stripping of oneself, post abuse, and the abuse itself feels like you've had your innocence taken away from you. It feels like something in your childhood has been robbed from you. And I talked to Sarah about that whenever she became aware, and the shared fantasy wasn't a thing for her anymore. Did she feel like she had her innocence taken away from her? And she's like, yes, yes, I did, because that was the way she acted in her infantile self. So it's so important to separate from the shared fantasy. You need to understand how the right brain works. You need to understand narcissistic personality disorder. You need to understand self-concept of them, and you need to understand the self-concept of yourself, and you need to understand object relations, and you just need a good therapist that's going to walk you through it. And you can be learning these things in the background. And much like everybody who gets narcissistic abused, we walk out of this with a fucking PhD in psychology, if we go down the right routes. And for some of us, and for me personally, that's exactly where I'm going to go, because I like it. It's been informative. And don't ever let your sort of abuse and your trauma go to waste. Peace out. Loads of love.